The dust kicked up in swirling clouds as Faith Baxter stepped off the stage coach, her face a stoic mask that betrayed none of the turmoil churning inside her. Shafter, Texas, 1875, a town she'd never imagined would become her home, much less the place she'd be married before sundown. The letter clutched in her hand felt like a death sentence rather than a proposal, but with her father's debts mounting and the bank threatening to seize their modest farm back in Missouri, she had little choice but to accept Ethan Calloway's offer. Faith had never met the man who would become her husband. Their arrangement had been negotiated through correspondence after her desperate father had written to his old Army friend about their dire situation. Ethan Calloway, a successful rancher in Shafter, needed a wife to help maintain his growing property and establish respectability in a town that was slowly transitioning from lawless frontier to civilized community. Faith needed security and a way to save her family from ruin. It was a simple transaction, not a romance. "Miss Baxter?" A deep voice interrupted her thoughts. Faith turned to see a tall man standing a few feet away. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, a simple button-up shirt, dark pants, and a vest that had seen better days. His hat was pushed back slightly, revealing sandy brown hair and eyes the color of a summer sky. A well-groomed mustache adorned his upper lip, and there was something unexpectedly gentle about his weather-beaten face. "Mr. Calloway?" she asked, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. He nodded, removing his hat and stepping forward. "Ethan Calloway, madam, welcome to Shafter." He extended his hand, which she accepted with a brief, formal shake. "Thank you for meeting me," she replied, noticing how his gaze seemed to carefully catalog her features. She knew what he saw: a thin woman of 22 with unremarkable brown hair pulled tightly into a practical bun, wearing a traveling dress that had once been fashionable but now showed signs of wear. Her only vanity was her eyes, which her mother had always said were the color of whiskey in sunlight. "Let me help you with your things," Ethan offered, gesturing to her two modest trunks. He signaled to a young boy loitering nearby who rushed to help load her belongings onto a wagon parked at the edge of the street. "The preacher is waiting," Ethan said simply. "I hope that's acceptable. I thought you might want to settle in at the ranch tonight rather than stay in town." Faith nodded, her heart hammering in her chest. "Of course, that was our agreement." As they walked down Shafter's main street, Faith took in her surroundings: a typical frontier town with wooden buildings lining both sides of the dusty road. A general store, a bank, a saloon, and various other establishments marked Shafter as a place of commerce and community, albeit a rough one. People glanced their way with obvious curiosity, and Faith held her head high despite her growing apprehension. The small white church at the end of the street seemed to loom larger with each step. Faith had imagined her wedding day since childhood, but never like this in a strange town, to a man she'd just met, with no family or friends to witness her vows. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. The preacher, a kindly older man named Reverend Watson, spoke the traditional words while Ethan's ranch foreman and the Reverend's wife served as witnesses. Faith spoke her vows clearly, promising to honor and obey the stranger beside her. But when the Reverend pronounced them man and wife and Ethan turned to her expectantly, she couldn't bring herself to smile. It was then, in the silent pause that followed, that Ethan leaned close and whispered words that would echo in her mind for months to come. "I'll wait till you mean it." He didn't try to kiss her, merely offering his arm as they exited the church as husband and wife. The ride to his ranch was mostly silent, with Ethan occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing brief pieces of information about the area. Faith responded politely but offered nothing more, her thoughts too chaotic to form meaningful conversation. The Calloway Ranch appeared on the horizon as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Faith couldn't help but admire the sprawling property: a large main house built of solid lumber, several outbuildings, corrals filled with horses, and cattle grazing on the surrounding land. It was far more substantial than she had imagined. "It's not much compared to the spreads further south," Ethan commented, misreading her silent appraisal as disappointment, "but it's growing." "It's impressive," Faith replied honestly. "You've built quite a life here." Something in Ethan's expression shifted at her words, a momentary glimpse of vulnerability before his features settled back into their careful neutrality. Built it from nothing, he acknowledged. But a house isn't a home without, he stopped himself, then simply added, well, that's why you're here. As the wagon pulled up to the house, a middle-aged woman emerged from the front door, wiping her hands on a well-worn apron. Mrs. Baxter, I mean Mrs. Calloway, Ethan corrected himself. This is Mrs. Hernandez. She helps with the cooking and housekeeping 3 days a week. The woman smiled warmly. Welcome, Senora. I have prepared a special dinner for your arrival. Faith returned the smile, her first genuine expression since arriving in Shafter. Thank you, Mrs. Hernandez. That's very kind. Ethan carried Faith's trunks into the house while she followed, taking in her new surroundings. The home was surprisingly comfortable, solid furniture, clean floors, and touches that spoke of care rather than mere utility. A bookshelf filled with volumes caught her eye immediately. You like to read? Ethan asked, noticing her interest. Very much, Faith admitted. My mother was a school teacher before she married. She taught me to love books. Help yourself to any of them, he offered. Not much time for reading during roundup and branding, but winter evenings get long out here, Mrs. Hernandez announced that dinner was ready, and they sat at the large oak table in the dining room. The meal was delicious roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and a sweet berry pie for dessert, but Faith found it difficult to eat, her appetite diminished by the enormity of the day's events. After Mrs. Hernandez departed for her own home in town, an awkward silence fell between the newlyweds. Ethan cleared his throat. I've prepared the main bedroom for you, he said carefully. I'll be taking the room down the hall for now. Faith looked up in surprise. But our arrangement can provide for your comfort and security without rushing other aspects of marriage, Ethan said, his words measured. I meant what I said in the church, Faith. I'll wait until you're ready, until you mean it. Relief and confusion warred within her. Thank you, she managed to say. That's considerate. I'm not the kind of man who forces himself where he's not wanted, Ethan replied, his voice taking on an edge that suggested personal history behind the statement. You fulfilled your part of the bargain by coming here. I've sent money to your father as agreed, the rest can wait, Faith nodded, unsure how to respond to this unexpected reprieve. I should retire, she said finally. It's been a long day, of course, Ethan stood. I'll show you to your room. The bedroom was spacious, with a large 4-poster bed, a wardrobe, and a dressing table with a mirror. A small vase of wildflowers sat on the bedside table, a thoughtful touch that caught Faith by surprise. The washroom is through there, Ethan indicated a door at the side of the room. I had hot water brought up earlier. Thank you, Faith said, standing awkwardly in the center of the room that now belonged to her. Ethan hesitated at the doorway. Breakfast is usually at sunrise, but sleep as long as you need tomorrow. You've had a long journey. After he left, Faith slowly unpacked her belongings, placing her few dresses in the wardrobe and setting her hairbrush on the dressing table. She changed into her nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing the tears she'd been holding back all day to fall. She cried for the home she'd left behind, for her parents struggling to rebuild their lives, for the dreams of love and marriage she'd harbored as a young girl, and for the uncertainty that lay before her. When the tears subsided, she washed her face with the now cool water in the basin and climbed into the unfamiliar bed. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. The house creaked and settled in ways different from her childhood home, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the moon. In the darkness, Faith wondered what kind of man Ethan Calloway truly was, and whether she would ever feel anything more for him than grateful obligation. Dawn arrived with the crowing of a rooster and the distant sounds of a ranch coming to life. Faith dressed in one of her everyday dresses, a simple blue cotton with white trim, and pinned her hair into its usual bun before making her way downstairs. She found Ethan in the kitchen, frying bacon and eggs on the large cast-iron stove. The domestic scene was unexpected, and she paused in the doorway, observing him. Good morning, he said, glancing up from his task. Coffee's hot, cups in the cabinet above the sink. Faith poured herself a cup of the strong brew. I didn't expect you to cook. A small smile played at the corner of Ethan's mouth. Mrs. Hernandez only comes Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Been fending for myself the rest of the time. He scooped the food onto 2 plates and placed them on the table. Nothing fancy, but it'll keep you going till noon. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Ethan spoke again. I thought I might show you around the ranch today if you're feeling up to it. Faith nodded. I'd like that, and I'd like to understand my duties here. She set down her fork. I want to be useful, Mr. Calloway. Ethan, he corrected gently, and you don't need to worry about being useful just yet. Take some time to adjust. I've never been one for idleness, Faith replied. Work has always been the best remedy for difficult circumstances. Something like respect flickered in Ethan's eyes. Very well. After breakfast, I'll give you the tour and we can discuss how you might help. The tour of the ranch was comprehensive, from the barn and stables to the chicken coop and vegetable garden. Ethan introduced Faith to the handful of cowboys who worked for him, all of whom tipped their hats respectfully to their boss's new wife. The men lived in a bunkhouse near the main house, except for the foreman, Samuel Porter, who had a small cabin of his own. Sam's been with me since I started, Ethan explained as they walked away from the bunkhouse. Fought together in the war, there's no man I trust more. He seems kind, Faith observed, recalling the older man's gentle manner when they'd met at the wedding. He is, Ethan agreed. Lost his wife and daughter to fever 10 years back, never remarried. The information added depth to the quiet sadness she'd noticed in the foreman's eyes. I'm sorry to hear that. They continued walking, and Ethan pointed out the fields where they grew hay for the livestock and a small orchard of apple and peach trees. It's much more diverse than I expected, Faith admitted. I thought cattle ranches focused solely on the herd. That's the main business, Ethan confirmed, but I believe in self-sufficiency. The garden and orchard feed us and we sell the extra in town. The hay fields save us buying feed in winter. As they approached a fenced pasture where several horses grazed, Ethan's expression softened. And these are my other pride and joy. I've been breeding quarter horses for the past 3 years. Faith moved closer to the fence, admiring the muscular animals with their gleaming coats. They're beautiful. A chestnut mare with a white blaze lifted her head and trotted toward them, nickering softly. That's Penny, Ethan said, reaching over to stroke the horse's nose. She's the gentlest of the bunch. Do you ride, Faith? A little, she admitted. We had an old plow horse that I sometimes rode as a girl. Penny might be a good mount for you once you're settled. Ethan glanced at her appraisingly. Every rancher's wife should know how to ride well. The tour concluded at the edge of a creek that ran through the property, providing water for both household and livestock. They sat on a fallen log, taking a moment's rest in the shade of a cottonwood tree. It's a fine place you've built, Faith said, breaking the silence. You should be proud. Ethan nodded, looking out over his land. It wasn't easy. Came to Texas with nothing but $20 in my saddle after the war, worked as a ranch hand, saved every penny. His voice took on a distant quality. Some folks thought I was crazy buying this land. Too close to Comanche territory, they said, but the treaties were holding by then and the price was right. Were there many attacks? Faith asked, suddenly aware of the vastness of the landscape around them, some in the early days, less now. Ethan's hand unconsciously moved to a scar on his forearm. The last raid on a neighboring ranch was 3 years ago. Most of the Comanche have been moved to reservations now. There was no triumph in his voice, only a somber acknowledgement of a changing world, and the town. Shafter seems to be growing. It is. The railroad might come through in a few years. That'll change everything. Ethan turned to look at her directly. Change isn't always bad, though sometimes it comes in unexpected ways. Faith understood he was no longer talking about the town, but about their own situation. Mr. Calloway, Ethan, I want you to know that I intend to honor our agreement in all ways. I may not have come here seeking love, but I will be a good wife to you. Ethan's blue eyes studied her face. I believe you will, Faith, and I'll try to be a good husband. He stood and offered his hand to help her up. Now let's head back. There's plenty of time to learn the rest. The days fell into a rhythm as Faith adjusted to her new life. She took over management of the household, planning meals with Mrs. Hernandez, maintaining the vegetable garden, and keeping the house in order. Ethan taught her to ride Penny, and soon Faith was comfortable enough to explore the ranch on horseback. They ate their meals together, and gradually the silence between them gave way to conversation. Faith learned that Ethan had fought for the Union during the Civil War, that he'd lost his parents to influenza when he was 16, and that he had a younger sister living in St. Louis whom he hadn't seen in years. In turn, she shared stories of her childhood in Missouri, her love of literature, and her mother's ongoing battle with rheumatism. At night, they retired to separate bedrooms, Ethan keeping his promise to wait until she was ready for more. Faith found herself increasingly curious about her husband, watching him when he wasn't aware the way he spoke gently to his horses, how his brow furrowed in concentration as he reviewed the ranch accounts, the rare smile that transformed his serious face when something amused him. One evening, about a month after her arrival, Faith was reading in the parlor when Ethan entered, his expression troubled. "Is something wrong?" she asked, setting aside her book. "Received word that rustlers hit the Henderson place last night," he said, pouring himself a small glass of whiskey. "Took 20 head of cattle and shot one of their hands." Faith's hand flew to her mouth. "How terrible is the man? He'll live, according to the message, but it's the third raid in 2 months." Ethan took a seat across from her, his face grim. "Sheriff wants to organize a group to track them. Asked if I'd join. When would you leave?" "Tomorrow at first light." Ethan studied the amber liquid in his glass. "Might be gone a few days, maybe a week." Faith nodded, surprised by the rush of concern she felt. "Of course you must go. Mr. Henderson is your friend, and if these men aren't stopped." "Sam will stay behind with 2 of the men to look after things here," Ethan continued. "If you need anything, I'll be fine," Faith assured him, though the thought of being essentially alone on the ranch was unsettling. "Just be careful." Ethan looked up, a flicker of something warm in his eyes. "Always am." The next morning, Faith rose before dawn to prepare a hearty breakfast for Ethan before his departure. As he strapped on his gun belt and checked his rifle, she packed him food for the trail: bread, jerky, and some dried apples. "Keep the doors locked at night," Ethan instructed as he prepared to leave. "Sam will check on you morning and evening." "I will," Faith promised. "Good luck finding the rustlers." Ethan hesitated, then reached out to squeeze her hand briefly. "Take care, Faith." She watched from the porch as he rode away with 3 of his cowboys, joining the sheriff and other ranchers at the edge of the property. Only when they had disappeared from sight did Faith acknowledge the knot of worry in her stomach. The days of Ethan's absence stretched longer than Faith had anticipated. She kept busy with her usual tasks and added some new ones, taking inventory of the pantry and root cellar, mending clothes that had been set aside, and riding Penny along the creek each afternoon to check the property boundaries as she'd seen Ethan do. On the 5th day, a powerful summer storm rolled in, bringing driving rain and spectacular lightning. Faith secured the chicken coop and helped the remaining cowboys move some of the more nervous horses into the barn before retreating to the house as the sky darkened ominously. The storm intensified as night fell. Faith lit oil lamps against the growing darkness and tried to focus on her needlework, but each crash of thunder made her jump. She had just decided to retire early when a pounding at the door startled her so badly she pricked her finger with the needle. "Who's there?" she called, approaching the door cautiously. "Mrs. Calloway." "It's Frank Simmons," came a young voice, barely audible over the rain. From the Miller place north of here. Faith opened the door to find a soaking wet boy of about 16 shivering on the porch. "Frank." "Come in, you're drenched." The boy stepped inside, water puddling around his boots. "I'm sorry to trouble you, madam, especially with Mr. Calloway away, but Pa sent me. Our barn roof collapsed in the storm and we've got nowhere to put the livestock. He was wondering if we might use your south pasture shed until we can rebuild." "Of course," Faith replied without hesitation. "You shouldn't have ridden all this way in such weather." "Pa would have come himself, but he broke his arm last week," Frank explained. "Ma's worried sick about the animals." Faith made a quick decision. "Wait here while I change, I'll ride back with you." "Oh no, madam, Mr. Calloway would skin me alive if I let you out in this weather." "Nonsense. Your family needs help and I can't send you back alone in this storm." Faith was already moving toward the stairs. "I'll only be a moment." 20 minutes later, Faith and Frank were riding through the downpour toward the Miller homestead, leading 2 of Ethan's strongest workhorses to help move the stranded livestock. The rain was relentless and visibility was poor, but Frank knew the way well enough to guide them. The scene at the Miller farm was one of controlled chaos. Half the barn roof had indeed collapsed, leaving the family's milk cows, horses, and other animals exposed to the elements. Mrs. Miller, a thin woman with a careworn face, was attempting to calm a frightened calf while her husband, arm in a crude sling, struggled to lead a stubborn mule to shelter. "Mrs. Calloway," Mrs. Miller exclaimed when she saw Faith, "you shouldn't have come out in this." "I brought help," Faith replied, dismounting and immediately moving to assist with the frightened animals. "Frank, can you and your father handle the horses? Mrs. Miller and I will see to the smaller animals." For the next 2 hours, they worked in the punishing rain, moving animals to temporary shelter and salvaging what they could from the damaged barn. Faith's dress was sodden, her hair plastered to her head, but she worked tirelessly alongside the Miller family, her earlier fear of the storm forgotten in the urgent task at hand. By midnight, all the animals were secured, either in the remaining portion of the barn or in makeshift pens near the house. Mrs. Miller insisted that Faith stay the night rather than risk the journey back to the Calloway ranch in the dark and storm. "I couldn't impose," Faith protested weakly, though the thought of the ride home was daunting. "You've done more than enough for us tonight," Mr. Miller said firmly. "It would ease my conscience to know you're safe here until morning." Faith relented, accepting the loan of a dry nightgown from Mrs. Miller and a place on the trundle bed in their daughter's room. Despite her exhaustion, she lay awake for some time, listening to the storm gradually subside and wondering what Ethan would think of her impulsive decision to help the neighbors. She returned to the ranch the next morning to find Sam Porter pacing the front porch, his weathered face lined with worry. When he spotted Faith riding up with Frank, his expression shifted from relief to confusion. "Mrs. Calloway, we were about to organize a search party." The foreman hurried down the steps to help her dismount. "Where have you been?" Faith explained the situation as Frank thanked her again and departed with promises to return the work horses once the Miller family had relocated all their livestock. "You rode out in that storm." Sam shook his head in disbelief. "Mr. Calloway won't be pleased." "The Millers needed help," Faith replied simply. "I couldn't turn them away." Sam studied her for a moment, then a slow smile spread across his face. "No, I reckon you couldn't. You're starting to belong here, Mrs. Calloway." His words stayed with Faith as she bathed away the mud and changed into clean clothes. Was she beginning to belong? The thought was both comforting and unsettling. This place that had felt so foreign a month ago was starting to feel like home, and the people including Ethan were becoming important to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. 2 days later, Faith was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard the sound of approaching riders. She shaded her eyes against the sun and felt her heart quicken as she recognized Ethan's tall figure leading the group. The men looked tired and trail-worn as they dismounted in front of the barn. Faith noticed that one of the cowboys had his arm in a makeshift sling, and Ethan himself moved with a stiffness that suggested injury. She hurried toward them, concern overriding her usual reserve. "Welcome back. Are you hurt?" Ethan turned at the sound of her voice, and something in his expression of fleeting softness made Faith's steps falter. "Nothing serious," he assured her, removing his hat. "Just a scrape." Faith noticed then the dried blood on his shirt collar and the shallow cut along his jawline. "You should let me clean that." Ethan instructed his men to see to the horses and followed Faith into the house, where she insisted he sit at the kitchen table while she fetched water and clean cloths. "Did you find the rustlers?" she asked as she gently cleaned the wound on his jaw. "We did," Ethan confirmed, wincing slightly at the sting of the water. "Holed up in an abandoned mine north of the Henderson place. There was a fight when we cornered them." "Is that how you were injured?" Ethan nodded. "One of them came at me with a knife." "Could have been worse. Sheriff Taylor took a bullet in the shoulder." Faith's hand stilled. "Will he recover?" "Doc thinks so. Left him in town to recuperate." Ethan's eyes met hers. "Sam told me what you did for the Millers." Faith resumed cleaning his wound, avoiding his gaze. "They needed help." "You rode out in the worst storm we've had this year." "It was the right thing to do," she replied, setting aside the cloth and reaching for a small jar of salve. Ethan caught her wrist gently. "I'm not angry, Faith. I'm impressed. Not many women would have shown such courage." Faith looked up in surprise, and for a moment they simply gazed at each other. Something shifted in the air between them, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of a connection deeper than their arranged circumstances. "The Millers are our neighbors," Faith said finally, "and neighbors help each other." "Isn't that how it works out here?" A slow smile spread across Ethan's face. "Yes, that's exactly how it works." As summer gave way to autumn, Faith found herself increasingly content with her life at the Calloway Ranch. The routine of ranch life suited her practical nature, and she took pride in seeing the difference her presence made, from the well-organized household to the flourishing garden to the new curtains she sewed for the parlor windows. More surprising was the growing warmth between her and Ethan. They still maintained separate bedrooms, but their evenings were often spent in companionable conversation by the fire. Faith discovered that her husband was well-read despite his limited formal education, and their discussions ranged from current events to literature to their hopes for the ranch's future. One crisp October morning, Faith was preparing to make preserves from the last of the season's peaches when Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway. "I need to ride into town for supplies," he announced. "Thought you might like to come along." Faith brightened at the suggestion. She hadn't been to Shafter since her arrival and was curious to see more of the town that was her new home. "I'd like that very much. Give me a few minutes to change." The wagon ride to town was pleasant, the autumn air cool but the sun warm on their faces. Faith wore her best dress, a burgundy poplin with black trim, and had arranged her hair more carefully than usual. "You look nice," Ethan commented as they set out, the simple compliment bringing a flush to Faith's cheeks. Shafter appeared busier than Faith remembered, with wagons and riders moving along the main street and people going about their business. Ethan pulled up in front of the general store and helped Faith down from the wagon. "I need to see about some fence posts and tools," he explained. "Why don't you look around? We can meet back here in an hour." Faith nodded, pleased at the chance to explore on her own. She spent some time in the general store, selecting a few small items: thread, buttons, and a bit of ribbon for a new bonnet she was planning to make. The shopkeeper, Mr. Tolliver, was effusive in his greetings. "Mrs. Calloway, a pleasure to finally make your proper acquaintance. How are you finding Shafter?" "Very welcoming, Mr. Tolliver," Faith replied with a smile, "though I haven't had much opportunity to visit until now." "Well, you picked a good day for it. Town's lively with the Harvest Festival Committee meeting today." He leaned forward conspirationally. "Mrs. Porter, the banker's wife, not to be confused with your foreman's late wife, has been asking when Ethan might bring you around. She chairs the Ladies' Aid Society." Faith made a mental note to seek out Mrs. Porter if time allowed, recognizing the importance of social connections in a small community. After completing her purchases, Faith wandered down the street, pausing to admire a display of fabric in the dressmaker's window. She was so absorbed that she didn't notice the approach of two women until they were directly beside her. "You must be Mrs. Calloway," said the older of the two, a plump woman in a fashionable green dress. "I'm Harriet Porter, and this is Louise Henderson." Faith turned with a smile, recognizing the names. "Yes, I'm Faith Calloway. It's a pleasure to meet you both. We've been hoping to make your acquaintance, Mrs. Henderson said warmly. "It's not often we get new faces in Shafter, especially one as interesting as Ethan Calloway's mail-order bride." Faith's smile faltered slightly at the blunt characterization, but she maintained her composure. "I understand your husband's ranch was targeted by the rustlers, Mrs. Henderson. I hope everything has been restored to order." "Thanks in part to your husband," Mrs. Henderson acknowledged. "James speaks highly of Ethan's tracking skills." "We were just heading to the hotel for tea, Mrs. Porter interjected. "Would you care to join us? Several ladies from town will be there to discuss the Harvest Festival." Faith hesitated only briefly before accepting. "That sounds lovely, though I'll need to meet Ethan in about half an hour." The hotel dining room was elegant by frontier standards, with white tablecloths and proper china. 5 other women were already seated at a large table, all of whom regarded Faith with undisguised curiosity as Mrs. Porter made the introductions. The conversation initially revolved around the upcoming Harvest Festival the first Shafter had organized, with discussion of food, decorations, and activities. Faith listened attentively, offering occasional suggestions based on similar events in her hometown. "You have a good eye for organization, Mrs. Calloway," commented Mrs. Watson, the Reverend's wife. "We could use your help with the planning committee." Before Faith could respond, a younger woman named Clara Davis spoke up. "Tell us, Mrs. Calloway, how are you finding married life?" "It must be quite an adjustment, wedding a man you'd never met." A hush fell over the table as the women awaited her response. Faith took a sip of tea, buying herself a moment to formulate her answer. "Ethan is a good man," she said carefully. "I'm fortunate in that regard. And yes, it has been an adjustment, but life often takes unexpected turns." "But surely it must be difficult," Clara persisted, her tone suggesting genuine concern though her eyes held a hint of mischief. "Ethan Calloway has quite a reputation as a man of few words and fewer smiles. Half the single women in the county tried to catch his eye before he sent away for you." "Clara," Mrs. Porter admonished, though she too looked interested in Faith's response. "I find that actions speak louder than words," Faith replied evenly. "And sometimes the most reserved men are simply the most thoughtful." Mrs. Watson nodded approvingly. "Well said, my dear, and how fortunate that Ethan found someone who appreciates his finer qualities." The conversation shifted to safer topics, but Faith was acutely aware of the scrutiny she remained under. These women were evaluating her, determining her place in their social hierarchy, and she was determined to acquit herself well for both her sake and Ethan's. When it was time to meet Ethan, Mrs. Porter insisted on walking her back to the general store. "You must join us for Sunday dinner soon," she said as they walked. "The Harvest Festival planning would benefit from your input, and it would give you a chance to become better acquainted with Shafter society." "Thank you for the invitation," Faith replied. "I'll discuss it with Ethan." Ethan was waiting by the wagon, deep in conversation with a tall, distinguished man whom Mrs. Porter identified as her husband, the banker. "Ah, Harriet," Mr. Porter greeted his wife. "I see you've met Mrs. Calloway." "Indeed we have," Mrs. Porter beamed. "She's agreed to help with the Harvest Festival. You'll bring her to Sunday dinner, won't you, Mr. Calloway?" Ethan glanced at Faith, a question in his eyes. When she gave a slight nod, he turned back to the banker's wife. "We'd be honored, Mrs. Porter." After farewells were exchanged, Ethan helped Faith into the wagon. As they pulled away from town, he asked, "Did you enjoy your visit?" "I did," Faith replied thoughtfully. "Everyone was very welcoming, though I suspect I was something of a curiosity." Ethan's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "I imagine you were. Shafter hasn't had much excitement since the last bank robbery 3 years ago." "Am I that exciting?" Faith laughed. "More than you know," Ethan said softly, his eyes on the road ahead. They rode in comfortable silence for a while before Faith spoke again. "Mrs. Porter seems quite influential in town." "She is," Ethan confirmed. "Her husband controls the money and she controls the social calendar. Best to stay on her good side." "I think I managed that," Faith mused. Though one of the women, Clara Davis, seemed determined to suggest our arrangement was unusual. Ethan's hands tightened on the reins. "Clara has a sharp tongue, always has." Something in his tone made Faith glance at him. "Did you know her well, before, I mean?" Ethan hesitated, then sighed. "Clara's father owned the property adjacent to mine when I first settled here. There was some expectation that we might. Well, it came to nothing." "I see," Faith said, surprised by the twinge of jealousy she felt. "Was she your sweetheart?" "No," Ethan replied firmly. "There was never anything between us, despite what her father might have hoped. Clara married Thomas Davis 2 years ago, a good match financially, if not temperamentally." Faith absorbed this information, wondering how many other secrets and histories she had yet to discover about her husband and the town they lived in. As they approached the ranch, Ethan suddenly pulled the wagon to a stop at a rise overlooking their property. The afternoon sun bathed the buildings and pastures in golden light, and in the distance, cattle grazed peacefully. "I come here sometimes," Ethan said, breaking the silence, "to remind myself how far I've come. When I first saw this land, it was nothing but wild grass and potential." He turned to look at Faith. "Kind of like us, I suppose." The simple statement, tinged with hope and vulnerability, touched something deep within Faith. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future not just of contentment but of genuine happiness with this quiet, determined man. "I think we have considerable potential, Ethan Calloway," she said softly. His smile, rare and transformative, was like the sun breaking through clouds. The Sunday dinner at the Porters' elegant home marked the beginning of Faith's integration into Shafter society. Mrs. Porter, having decided that the new Mrs. Calloway was an asset to their community, introduced Faith to the town's leading citizens and ensured she was included in the Harvest Festival Planning Committee. Faith embraced these new responsibilities with characteristic determination. She spent one afternoon each week in town, working with the other women on festival preparations while also establishing herself as a thoughtful, capable individual in her own right. Ethan supported her involvement, seeming pleased by her growing confidence and the respect she earned from their neighbors. At home, the dynamic between them continued to evolve. Their evenings often found them sharing the sofa in the parlor, Faith with her needlework and Ethan reading aloud from one of his books. Sometimes their hands would brush as they reached for something, or their eyes would meet across the dinner table, and Faith would feel a flutter of anticipation in her stomach. One evening in early November, as the first true cold snap settled over the land, Ethan returned from checking on a pregnant mare to find Faith struggling to build up the fire in the parlor. "Here, let me," he offered, taking the poker from her hand. Their fingers touched and neither pulled away immediately. "Thank you," Faith said, her voice slightly breathless. "I'm not very good with fires. It's all in knowing how to arrange the logs," Ethan explained, demonstrating as he spoke. "Too close together and they smother, too far apart and they burn out too quickly." Faith watched him work, admiring the sure movements of his hands. "Is that a metaphor for something, Mr. Calloway?" Ethan glanced up, a rare playfulness in his expression. "Could be, Mrs. Calloway." The fire blazed to life, casting a warm glow over the room. Outside, the wind howled around the corners of the house, but inside all was cozy and secure. "I received a letter from my parents today," Faith said as they settled on the sofa. "They've managed to keep the farm, thanks to the money you sent." "I'm glad to hear it," Ethan replied. "How are they faring otherwise?" "Well enough. Mother's health is improved and they've hired a young man to help with the heavier work." Faith hesitated. "They asked about us about our marriage." Ethan's eyes met hers. "And what did you tell them?" "That we're building something good," Faith answered honestly. "That you're a fair and decent man and that I'm content." "Just content?" Ethan asked quietly. Faith set aside her sewing and turned to face him fully. "What would you have me say, Ethan?" He reached out slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "I'd have you say what you truly feel, Faith, nothing more, nothing less." "I feel," Faith took a deep breath, "I feel more than I expected to. More than I thought possible when I stepped off that stagecoach." Ethan's hand lingered near her face. "As do I." The moment stretched between them, fraught with possibility. Then, with gentle determination, Ethan leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened as Faith responded. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing unevenly. Ethan rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if committing the moment to memory. "I've wanted to do that since the first time I saw you scowl at me in the church," he admitted with a soft laugh. Faith pulled back in surprise. "I didn't scowl." "You most certainly did." "Right after the Reverend pronounced us man and wife." Ethan's thumb traced the curve of her cheek. It was magnificent, all that defiance and determination in one look. Faith felt her face warm at the memory. "I was terrified and trying not to show it." "I know," Ethan said simply. "That's what made it magnificent." They sat together in the firelight, talking in low voices about nothing and everything, hopes and fears, memories and dreams. When the clock on the mantel struck 10, Faith reluctantly rose. "It's late," she said, though she made no move toward the stairs. Ethan stood as well, taking her hands in his. "Faith," he began, his voice serious. "I meant what I said on our wedding day. I'll wait until you're ready. There's no rush." Faith studied their joined hands, then looked up into the face that had become so dear to her. "What if I'm ready now?" Ethan's expression was a mixture of surprise, hope, and unmistakable desire. Without a word, he lifted her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her palm, then led her up the stairs to the bedroom that had been hers alone for the past 4 months. Their lovemaking was tender and unhurried, a discovery of each other that went beyond the physical to something deeper and more profound. Afterward, Faith lay in the circle of Ethan's arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "You're smiling," Ethan observed, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. Faith propped herself up to look at him. "Am I?" he confirmed, his own smile evident in the dim light of the single candle. "It's the first time you've smiled like that since you came here." "Like what?" "Like you mean it," Ethan replied softly. "Like you're truly happy." Faith leaned down to kiss him, pouring all the emotion she felt into the gesture. "I am," she whispered against his lips. "I'm happy, Ethan." The Harvest Festival, held the week before Thanksgiving, was a tremendous success. The entire population of Shafter and many from the surrounding ranches gathered in the town square for music, dancing, games, and an abundance of food. Faith, who had helped organize the event, found herself the recipient of numerous compliments and invitations. "You've certainly made an impression," Ethan commented as they watched children competing in a three-legged race. "Mrs. Porter just told me you're the best thing to happen to Shafter since the schoolhouse was built." Faith laughed. "High praise indeed, though I suspect she's just relieved that I'm not as scandalous as a mail-order bride ought to be." Ethan's arm tightened around her waist. "You're exactly as scandalous as I'd hoped," he murmured in her ear, making her blush. The change in their relationship had been noticed by those closest to them. Mrs. Hernandez had merely smiled knowingly when she found them sharing breakfast in their nightclothes one morning, and Sam Porter had commented that the boss seemed a sight more cheerful these days. As the afternoon wore on, the musicians struck up a lively tune, and couples began to form for dancing. Ethan turned to Faith with a formal bow. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Calloway?" Faith placed her hand in his. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Calloway." They joined the other dancers, moving together with the ease of people who had grown comfortable in each other's space. Faith had never seen Ethan so relaxed in public, his usual reserve softened by the festive atmosphere and perhaps by the happiness they had found together. "Look at Clara Davis watching us," Faith whispered as they turned. "She seems utterly perplexed." Ethan glanced over his shoulder at the young woman who had once tried to probe their relationship for weaknesses. "Perplexed is better than spiteful. Besides," he added with a grin, "we're giving her something new to gossip about." As the dance ended, Ethan kept hold of Faith's hand. "Let's go for a walk," he suggested, leading her away from the crowd toward the quieter end of the street. They strolled in companionable silence until they reached the small town park with its newly planted trees and wooden benches. The sounds of the festival were muted here, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. "I have something for you," Ethan said, reaching into his pocket. "I've been waiting for the right moment." He withdrew a small velvet pouch and placed it in Faith's hand. She opened it carefully, tipping the contents into her palm, a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfectly cut diamond. "Ethan," she breathed, looking up at him in surprise. "What is this?" "A proper wedding ring," he explained. "The one we used in the ceremony was my mother's, but it was always too big for you." He took the ring from her palm and slid it onto her finger alongside the plain gold band she already wore. "This one is yours alone." The diamond caught the late afternoon sunlight, sending prisms of color dancing across her hand. "It's beautiful," Faith said, her voice thick with emotion. "But when did you?" "I ordered it from San Antonio after our first trip to town together," Ethan admitted, "when you said we had potential." Faith's eyes filled with tears as she remembered that moment on the ridge overlooking their ranch. "You were planning this even then?" "I was hoping," Ethan corrected gently. "Hoping that one day you might wear it as more than just a symbol of our arrangement." He took both her hands in his. "I love you, Faith Calloway. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you stepped off that stagecoach looking like you were marching to your execution." Faith laughed through her tears. "I was so frightened and trying so hard not to show it." "You were magnificent," Ethan said, echoing his earlier sentiment. "Strong and determined and so beautiful it took my breath away." "And now," Faith asked softly, "now you're even more magnificent," Ethan replied, drawing her close. "Because now when you smile at me, I know you mean it." Faith wrapped her arms around his neck. "I love you, Ethan Calloway. Not because of our arrangement, not because you saved my family, but because of who you are, the man who promised to wait until I was ready, who gave me time to find my own way to happiness." Their kiss was a promise, deep and sure, witnessed only by the rustling trees and the distant sounds of celebration. When they returned to the festival, hand in hand and Faith's new ring glinting in the fading light, they were greeted by knowing smiles and warm congratulations. It seemed the entire town had been waiting for this confirmation of what many had already suspected, that the arranged marriage between Ethan Calloway and Faith Baxter had blossomed into something genuine and lasting. The months that followed were the happiest of Faith's life. Winter settled over the ranch, bringing shorter days and long, cozy evenings spent in front of the fire. Christmas was celebrated with a small gathering of friends: Sam Porter, Mrs. Hernandez and her family, and a few of the neighboring ranchers, including the Millers, whose barn had been successfully rebuilt with community help. Faith threw herself into making their home truly theirs, adding feminine touches that Ethan claimed to find frivolous but clearly appreciated. They established traditions: Sunday rides across the property when weather permitted, reading aloud to each other in the evenings, breakfast in bed on particularly cold mornings. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, bringing wildflowers to the pastures and new calves to the herd. Faith's garden flourished under her attentive care, and she took particular pride in the rose bushes she planted along the front of the house, a splash of beauty in the practical world of the ranch. It was a warm day in late April when Faith first suspected she might be expecting a child. She had been feeling unusually tired and had twice excused herself from the breakfast table when the smell of coffee, usually a favorite, suddenly turned her stomach. After the third morning of similar symptoms, she confided her suspicions to Mrs. Hernandez. "Ah, Senora," the older woman said with a knowing smile, "it would not surprise me, you have that glow about you." Faith visited the doctor in Shafter the following week, using the excuse of shopping for supplies to make the trip without raising Ethan's concerns. Dr. Wilson confirmed what she already suspected: she was approximately 2 months pregnant, with the baby expected to arrive in late November. She kept the news to herself for another week, wanting to find the perfect moment to tell Ethan. The opportunity came during one of their Sunday rides, when they stopped at the ridge overlooking the ranch, the same spot where, months earlier, Ethan had spoken of potential. "It's hard to believe it's been almost a year since I arrived," Faith commented as they sat side by side on a fallen log, their horses grazing nearby. "Best year of my life," Ethan replied, taking her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm, a gesture that had become habitual between them. Faith smiled, her heart full. "Mine too, and I think next year might be even better." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Oh, what makes you say that?" Faith guided his hand to rest on her still flat abdomen. "Because our family will be growing." For a moment, Ethan stared at her in confusion. Then understanding dawned, his eyes widening. "Faith, are you saying?" She nodded, tears of joy beginning to spill down her cheeks. "Dr. Wilson says the baby will come in late November." Ethan's expression transformed from shock to wonder to pure, unadulterated happiness. He gathered Faith into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby." "Are you pleased?" Faith asked, though his reaction left little doubt. Ethan pulled back to look at her, his eyes suspiciously bright. "Pleased doesn't begin to cover it. I don't even have the words, Faith." He placed his hand gently on her stomach again. "When I sent that letter to your father, I was hoping for a wife, someone to share the work and the loneliness. I never dared hope for love, for happiness like this." Faith covered his hand with her own. "When I stepped off that stagecoach, I was resigned to a life of duty and obligation. I never imagined I'd find a partner, a friend, a lover, a family of my own." They stayed on the ridge until the sun began to set, talking excitedly about the future, the nursery they would prepare, names they might consider, the kind of parents they hoped to be. As they rode back to the ranch, side by side in the golden light of evening, Faith felt a profound sense of rightness, as if all the paths of her life had been leading to this place, this man, this moment. Word of Faith's pregnancy spread quickly through Shafter, bringing a stream of well-wishers and advice-givers to the Calloway ranch. Mrs. Porter organized a quilting circle to create a blanket for the baby, while Mrs. Henderson presented Faith with a beautifully carved wooden cradle that had been passed down through her family. Ethan, to Faith's amusement and tenderness, became almost comically protective. He insisted on hiring an additional ranch hand so that Faith wouldn't feel obligated to take on too many household duties. He read every book on pregnancy and childbirth he could find, peppering Dr. Wilson with questions during the man's monthly visits to check on Faith's progress. "You're going to wear yourself out worrying before this baby even arrives," Faith teased one evening as Ethan insisted on building up the fire despite the mild autumn weather. "I just want to make sure you're comfortable," he replied, adjusting a pillow behind her back. Faith captured his hand, tugging him down to sit beside her on the sofa. "I am perfectly comfortable, especially when my overprotective husband actually sits still for 5 minutes," Ethan grinned sheepishly. "Am I being ridiculous?" "Just a little," Faith admitted, leaning against his shoulder. "But it's rather endearing." As her pregnancy progressed, Faith's body changed in ways that sometimes left her feeling ungainly and self-conscious. Ethan, however, seemed to find her increasingly beautiful, telling her so with words and tender touches that banished her insecurities. The baby's impending arrival brought changes to the ranch as well. Ethan converted the small bedroom adjacent to theirs into a nursery, painting the walls himself and installing a window seat where Faith could sit and rock the baby. Sam Porter, revealing a previously unknown talent for woodworking, crafted a rocking horse as a gift for the child's future enjoyment. November arrived with unseasonably mild weather, for which Faith was grateful as she entered the final weeks of her pregnancy. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, as she and Ethan sat on the porch enjoying the gentle sunshine, a rider appeared on the horizon. "That's odd," Ethan remarked, shading his eyes. "Wasn't expecting anyone today." As the rider drew closer, Faith recognized the distinctive silhouette of Reverend Watson on his old mare. Ethan rose to greet their visitor, helping the aging minister dismount. "Reverend Watson, this is a pleasant surprise," Faith called from her seat, too unwieldy now to rise quickly. The Reverend approached with a smile, though Faith noticed he seemed unusually solemn beneath his cordial greeting. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion on your day of rest," he said, accepting the glass of lemonade Ethan offered. "But I've received some correspondence that I felt should be delivered promptly." He withdrew an envelope from his pocket and handed it to Faith. "This arrived yesterday, addressed to Mrs. Faith Calloway in care of the church. The sender is a Mr. James Baxter." Faith took the letter with surprise. "From my father, but why would he send it to the church rather than directly here?" Reverend Watson shook his head. "I couldn't say, my dear. Perhaps he was unsure of the exact address." Faith broke the seal and unfolded the letter, her expression changing from curiosity to concern as she read. Ethan watched her intently, moving to sit beside her when he noticed her hands begin to tremble. "Faith, what is it?" She looked up, her eyes filled with distress. "It's Mother. She's taken a turn for the worse. The rheumatism has spread to her heart. Father says." Her voice broke. "Father says she's asking for me, that the doctor doesn't think she has much time." Ethan's arm went around her shoulders. "When was this letter written?" Faith checked the date. 2 weeks ago. It must have been delayed in transit." "Then there's no time to waste," Ethan said decisively, turning to Reverend Watson. "When is the next train east from Junction City?" "Tomorrow morning, I believe," the Reverend replied. "But surely Mrs. Calloway can't travel in her condition." Faith placed a protective hand on her swollen abdomen. The baby wasn't due for another 2 weeks, but the thought of traveling so far so late in her pregnancy was daunting. "I have to go," she said quietly. "She's my mother, Ethan, if there's any chance to see her." Ethan's expression was torn between concern for his wife and understanding of her need. "What does Dr. Wilson say about travel at this stage?" He advised against long journeys after the 8th month, Faith admitted. "But I feel well, truly I do, and Junction City is only a day's ride from here." Reverend Watson cleared his throat. "If I may make a suggestion, my sister-in-law is a midwife in St. Louis. If you were to break your journey there, she could examine Mrs. Calloway and advise whether it's safe to continue on to Missouri." Ethan nodded slowly. "That seems sensible." He turned to Faith. "If Dr. Wilson agrees that you can travel as far as St. Louis, we'll leave tomorrow." Faith asked. "Of course," Ethan replied, as if surprised by the question. "I wouldn't let you make this journey alone, especially now." Faith's eyes filled with tears of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, leaning into his embrace. Dr. Wilson, summoned from town that evening, reluctantly agreed that Faith could travel as far as St. Louis with proper precautions. But no further without consulting another physician, he insisted. And at the first sign of labor, you stop wherever you are. Is that understood? Faith and Ethan both nodded solemnly, and preparations for their journey began immediately. Mrs. Hernandez packed food for the initial stage of their trip, while Sam Porter promised to oversee the ranch in their absence. They left at dawn the next day, traveling by wagon to Junction City, where they boarded the eastbound train. The journey was uncomfortable for Faith, whose back ached and whose ankles swelled despite Ethan's constant attentions. But the urgency of her mother's condition drove her forward, and 3 days later they arrived in St. Louis. Reverend Watson's sister-in-law, Mrs. Abigail Thornton, met them at the station and insisted they stay at her home while Faith rested and was examined. The midwife's assessment was cautiously optimistic. "The baby is positioned well," she told them, and Mrs. Calloway shows no signs of early labor. However, the journey has taken its toll. I recommend at least 2 days rest before continuing on to Missouri. Those 2 days were agonizing for Faith, torn between concern for her mother and the responsibility to protect her unborn child. Ethan was her rock, holding her when she wept with frustration and assuring her that they would reach her parents' home in time. On the third morning, with Mrs. Thornton's blessing, they boarded the train for the final leg of their journey. By late afternoon, they were hiring a wagon in the small Missouri town where Faith had grown up. The Baxter farm looked smaller than Faith remembered, the fields not as vast, the house more weathered. As Ethan helped her down from the wagon, the front door opened and her father emerged thinner than she recalled, his face deeply lined with worry and age. "Faith," he called, hurrying down the steps. He stopped short when he saw her condition, his eyes widening. "My God, girl, you're about to burst." Despite the gravity of the situation, Faith couldn't help but laugh. "It's good to see you too, Father." James Baxter embraced his daughter carefully, then shook Ethan's hand with genuine warmth. "You must be the man who saved us," he said simply. "I'm grateful you've brought my daughter home." "How is Mother?" Faith asked, her momentary levity fading, her father's expression sobered. "Holding on, she's been waiting for you." Faith's mother, Margaret Baxter, lay propped up on pillows in the bed she'd shared with her husband for 30 years. Her once plump face was gaunt, her breathing labored, but her eyes lit up with joy when Faith entered the room. "My baby girl," she whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. Faith moved to the bedside as quickly as her unwieldy body would allow, clasping her mother's hand and pressing it to her cheek. "I'm here, Mother." Margaret's gaze moved to Faith's stomach. "And bringing a grandbaby, I see." A weak smile curved her lips. "I had hoped." "You'll meet him or her soon," Faith promised, though they both recognized the gentle fiction in her words. For the next 2 days, Faith divided her time between her mother's bedside and necessary rest, with Ethan hovering attentively nearby. She told her mother about the ranch, about Shafter, and about the husband who had started as a stranger but become the center of her world. "I want to meet this remarkable man," Margaret insisted, and so Ethan was brought into the sick room. He approached the bed with uncharacteristic hesitation, removing his hat and bowing slightly. "Mrs. Baxter, it's an honor to meet you." Margaret studied him with eyes that, despite her illness, remained sharp and perceptive. "You love my daughter," she stated rather than asked. "With all my heart," Ethan replied without hesitation. "Good," Margaret nodded weakly. "That's all a mother needs to know." On the evening of the third day, as Faith sat reading to her mother while Ethan and her father talked quietly in the kitchen, Margaret Baxter drew her final breath. It was peaceful, a gentle sigh, a relaxing of features long tightened by pain, and then stillness. Faith wept in Ethan's arms that night, grieving the loss yet grateful that she had arrived in time to say goodbye. The next morning, as they made arrangements for the funeral, Faith felt the first unmistakable contractions. "Ethan," she gasped, clutching his arm as pain radiated across her lower back. "I think the baby is coming." The local doctor was summoned immediately. After examining Faith, he confirmed that she was indeed in the early stages of labor. "First babies often take their time," he reassured them, "but given the circumstances, we should prepare for a birth within the next day or so." The timing seemed both cruel and fitting, one life ending as another began. Faith's father, pushing aside his own grief, threw himself into preparations for both his wife's funeral and his grandchild's arrival. The labor progressed steadily through the day and into the night. Ethan never left Faith's side, supporting her through each contraction, wiping her brow and murmuring encouragement when her strength began to flag. "I can't do this," Faith moaned as dawn approached and the pain intensified. "It's too much, Ethan." "You can," he insisted, his voice firm but gentle. "You're the strongest person I know, Faith Calloway. You rode out in a thunderstorm to save a neighbor's livestock. You traveled halfway across the country while 9 months pregnant. You can bring our child into this world." His words gave her the courage to continue, and as the sun rose on a new day, their son was born, a robust boy with a shock of dark hair and his father's blue eyes. "He's perfect," Ethan whispered, cradling the swaddled infant with a mixture of awe and terror. "Look what we made, Faith." Exhausted but radiant, Faith reached for her son. "Hello, little one, you've had quite a journey already." They named him Thomas James Calloway, Thomas for Ethan's father, James for Faith's. He was baptized 3 days later in the same small church where his grandmother was laid to rest. A bittersweet ceremony that acknowledged both the grief and joy that had entwined in their lives. James Baxter, suddenly alone in the home he had shared with his wife for decades, faced a difficult decision. When Ethan suggested he might consider returning to Texas with them, the older man initially hesitated. "This land has been in the Baxter family for generations," he explained as they sat on the farmhouse porch, baby Thomas sleeping in Faith's arms. "I always thought I'd die here, just as Margaret did." "The offer remains open," Ethan said. "There's plenty of room at the ranch, and I could use an experienced hand like yourself." A week after the funeral, as they prepared for the journey back to Shafter, James announced his decision. "I'll sell the farm to the Henderson boy who's been helping me," he declared. "He's a good lad and he'll honor the land, but I find I'm not ready to be parted from my daughter and my grandson just yet." The return journey to Texas was slower and more comfortable than their frantic trip east. They broke the travel into short segments, staying at hotels along the way to allow Faith and the baby ample rest. James Baxter proved to be an excellent traveling companion, entertaining them with stories of Faith's childhood and taking his turn holding his grandson with grandfatherly pride. Their arrival in Shafter caused quite a stir. Word had spread of Margaret Baxter's passing and of the baby's birth, and a delegation of townspeople met their train with casseroles, baby blankets, and offers of assistance. "It's a bit overwhelming," Faith confessed to Ethan as they finally reached the ranch, where Sam Porter and Mrs. Hernandez waited to welcome them home. "It's what community means," Ethan replied, carrying his sleeping son toward the house that had never felt more like a home than it did in that moment. "Something I never truly understood until you came into my life." Winter settled over the Calloway Ranch once more, but this year the house was filled with the sounds of a baby's cries and laughter. James Baxter took to ranch life with surprising enthusiasm, proving himself adept at animal husbandry and becoming Sam Porter's frequent companion for checkers in the evening. Thomas grew rapidly, a good-natured child with his mother's curiosity and his father's calm disposition. Faith found motherhood both more challenging and more rewarding than she had anticipated, and Ethan's obvious delight in his son added a new dimension to their relationship. One snowy evening in February, as they sat before the fire with Thomas sleeping contentedly in his cradle nearby, Faith reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past 18 months. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "How different my life is from what I imagined when I agreed to marry you," Faith replied, leaning against his shoulder. "How frightened I was stepping off that stagecoach and how determined not to show it," Ethan chuckled, wrapping his arm around her. "You did a poor job of hiding it." "Your chin was so high I thought you'd strain your neck," Faith laughed softly. "I was preparing myself for duty, for a life of practical arrangement I never expected." She gestured around them at the comfortable room, the sleeping baby, the evidence of a life richly lived. "Happiness." Ethan suggested. "Love," Faith corrected, turning to meet his gaze. "I never expected to fall in love with you, Ethan Calloway." And yet here we are, he murmured, brushing a kiss against her forehead. Here we are, Faith agreed. And when you said you'd wait until I met my smile, my affection, did you truly believe that day would come? I hoped, Ethan admitted. Hoped more than I'd ever hoped for anything in my life. Even more than for this land, Faith teased gently. Ethan's expression turned serious. This land was a dream of security, of building something lasting. But you, Faith, you were a dream I hardly dared acknowledge, even to myself. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Inside, before the crackling fire, Faith Calloway smiled at her husband, a genuine smile filled with all the love and joy she had found in this unexpected life. I mean it now, she whispered, leaning in to kiss him. Every smile, every touch, every moment, I mean it all. Ethan gathered her close, his voice rough with emotion. That's all I ever wanted. And as their son slept peacefully nearby, secure in the knowledge of his parents' love, Faith reflected that sometimes the greatest journeys were not those measured in miles, but in the distance between two hearts finding their way to each other. 5 years later, the Calloway Ranch had prospered beyond Ethan's most optimistic projections. The railroad had indeed come to Shafter, bringing new opportunities for cattle shipping and making the town an important hub for the region. Ethan's breeding program for quarter horses had gained a reputation throughout Texas, with buyers coming from as far away as Kentucky to purchase his stock. Faith had flourished as well. She had taken over the management of the ranch's finances, revealing a previously untapped talent for business that complemented Ethan's practical knowledge of ranching. She had also become a respected figure in Shafter, serving on the school board and organizing a lending library for the community. Their family had grown to include a daughter, Margaret Rose, born almost 3 years after Thomas and bearing a striking resemblance to the grandmother she had never met. The children were the center of their parents' world, Thomas, with his father's quiet determination and love of horses, Margaret with her mother's quick mind and independent spirit. James Baxter had built a small cabin on the edge of the ranch property, insisting on his own space while remaining very much a part of the family's daily life. He had taken charge of the orchard, expanding it considerably and experimenting with different varieties of fruit trees. On a warm spring evening, as the family gathered on the porch after dinner, Faith watched her children playing in the yard with the puppy Ethan had brought home the previous month. James sat nearby, whittling a small wooden horse for Thomas, while Ethan stood leaning against the porch railing, his gaze alternating between his children and the sunset painting the western sky. "Penny for your thoughts," Faith said, moving to stand beside her husband. Ethan smiled, drawing her into the circle of his arm. "Just counting my blessings," he replied. "They're numerous these days." Faith rested her head against his shoulder, savoring the moment of peace. "Do you ever think about that day at the church when the Reverend pronounced us man and wife?" "Often," Ethan admitted. "Especially the part where you looked like you might bolt for the door at any moment." Faith laughed softly. "I considered it, for about 3 seconds." "What stopped you?" "The way you looked at me," Faith replied thoughtfully. "Like you saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself yet. And when you said you'd wait until I met my smile, my affection, it was the first time in months that I felt like I had a choice about anything in my life." Ethan pressed a kiss to her temple. "Best gamble I ever took," saying those words. "I had no idea if you'd ever come to care for me." "And now?" Faith asked, turning in his arms to face him. Ethan's eyes, as blue and clear as the day they'd met, crinkled at the corners with his smile. "Now I have no doubts at all, Faith Calloway. Not a single one." As the sunset faded and their children's laughter filled the evening air, Faith reflected that happiness often came in unexpected packages, sometimes in the form of an arranged marriage to a quiet rancher who had the patience to wait for love to blossom in its own time. "Neither do I," she whispered, rising on tiptoe to kiss him as she had thousands of times before, each one more meaningful than the last. "Not a single doubt in the world."